Hey all, it's Tracy Novick. It's gotten so that I can tell when a phone call goes out, even if all of my phones in the house don't go off, because I start getting messages right away. So for those of you who just got the phone call and thought, wait a minute, we started a new schedule, where is it? I did just repost that on this page, so you should be able to find it. It's also linked on Twitter, and I've got it up as a post on Instagram. Remember, if you're elementary, the main change is the synchronous time on Fridays. If you're secondary, you don't have to panic for tomorrow morning. The first change that happens on Tuesday. This is week A, by the way. Week B is next week, and then we alternate. Someone asked me that question, and I realized that wasn't necessarily very clear. So week A this week, week B next week. And the first change really for secondary starts with that earlier Tuesday and Thursday mornings. So that starts this week, starts tomorrow. If you are a secondary school student, if you have a secondary school student, please make sure they're ready for that shift in terms of time. That was, of course, voted on Thursday. As I mentioned on Thursday, and I think I posted here, I posted on the blog, that is actually open for public comment. The regulation change was an emergency regulation change by the state. That is only good for 3 months. And so the Board of Ed has to vote it at the end of February. They are open for public comment, and they take that from anyone. So if you've got something to say about the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education thinking that the answer to mental health stress among students in a pandemic is 40 hours of Zoom, as probably you can guess I do, you can send that in to them. And so I would encourage you to do that. The other thing, of course, that we voted on Thursday is we did vote to postpone the January 25th date for students coming back into the buildings. That obviously was the Group C students, which is the high need special education students, vocational students, and then the alternative program and some of our ELL students. That is really kind of a twofold thing. One, honestly, simply just because our COVID rates are through the roof, both as a state, as a city, everywhere. As I mentioned on Thursday, and I linked to them in the comment thread that I posted on Thursday night, there's actually been research over the last couple of weeks that looks at rates of COVID in the community, both in terms of positivity, and then there also was some research that looked at in terms of hospital admissions, and essentially how safe it was then to open schools. We are well in excess in terms of the numbers on both of those studies. So it isn't just that it feels like we're kind of under stress and under strain here. There's now actually some growing body of research that shows that it's not really a great time to be sending people back into the buildings, regardless of what the governor says. So that was the other thing we decided. What does that mean? Because we didn't necessarily give a date. If you remember, the kind of everybody else who was going to go hybrid group was supposed to start in early March. Effectively, as we start to get towards that, the question will become, are we going to keep that big sort of gap that was going to roll in the rest of everyone else? Or is this going to become something where we're bringing people back more quickly together? Because the other half of this, as you probably heard from Dr. Hirsch, either on Thursday, if you listened to the press conference, or it also was mentioned Thursday night at our meeting, we are tomorrow starting vaccinations at the Worcester Senior Center for our EMS and first responders, police, fire, and so forth. The hope is to get that up to 350 people a day, which would actually get us through our first responders pretty quickly. Massachusetts is doing a good job of getting vaccinations into arms, as they keep saying, pretty much as quickly as we can get them. So the hope is that we can actually get to phase 2, which would be educators, or would include educators, pretty quickly. Now, there still is essentially kind of a 2-month cycle of you get the first shot, you wait a month, you get the second shot, you start to acquire immunity during that second month. But we're reaching the light at the end of the tunnel here. And I know, at least from my perspective, part of this is actually just trying to get as many people through the next several months, not only alive, but as healthy as possible. And I think that a lot of our decisions are kind of going to be based around that piece too, which is this is not as much a thing where we're in it for the long haul anymore. This is more about a couple of months ahead of us, both in terms of getting off of the high peak, but also seeing more and more vaccinations roll out. And we are lucky, of course, the vaccination is as effective as it is. The third thing that may be of interest that we did on Thursday is we did pass a 1-year change in the admissions policy for Worcester Tech. As I think everybody knows, we didn't have the MCAS in the spring. MCAS was part of how we considered admission for Worcester Tech. And also, of course, attendance was sort of all over the place. So attendance effectively becomes sort of this hold harmless bar. Then there was consideration of grades, consideration of conduct and effort, and then consideration of the sort of joint recommendation from the group of people at the middle school that know the student. We did have something of a conversation around the questions of equity, questions of bias in terms of things like conduct and effort grades. This is a 1-year change. We are going to be long-term changing the admissions requirements. That should be coming to us over the next couple of months too, and it will go to subcommittee. So there'll be more of a sort of a longer conversation. That's in part, of course, because the state has flagged our admissions requirements. And they're also, of course, looking at the regional VOTEC admissions requirements statewide. So obviously more to come on that. And also, while we're talking about secondary schools, Mr. Manfredo did, he actually tried to change on the spot the start time for secondary school students. That's not really something we can do like that, particularly if we're going to bring everyone back into the buildings this year. But because we do have our transportation contract up this year, it is a really good time for us to have a conversation around if we can shift secondary school start times. For those who don't know, there's solid and pretty universal agreement on secondary school start times needing to be later, simply because of the way that the biology of a teenager works. This isn't them being late. This isn't them being lazy. This isn't them, being up on whatever until all hours. It really is that biologically their functioning doesn't start until later in the morning. And it's not only an academic performance issue, although it certainly is. It also gets into things like health and safety, like car accidents among teenagers go down when you pull their school times back, and other things like that happen. So that went to my subcommittee. I will make sure that I'm really public about when we're going to talk about that, because I know it's of interest not only to students, but also to teachers and also to families. And the only other thing that I did want to say is sort of twofold about what happened this week in Washington, D.C. First of all, I know a lot of you were sort of coming out of classes and then effectively had to kind of turn around Wednesday night and not only do some of your own processing, but try to figure out what you were going to say to students on Thursday morning. As someone who still remembers walking back into my classroom the morning after April vacation, after Columbine happened, and yes, I'm that old, I know something of how hard that is. And I want to say how much I appreciate any of you who made space, made time, and helped kids process and helped kids with making sure that their stories were straight. I think it's probably about the hardest thing that we ever ask educators to do. And I want to say how much I appreciate that as a member of the committee. The other thing, though, that I also wanted to say as a member of the committee is that as local elected officials, we take an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States, just as the president does, just as the Congress does. And there are a lot of people who violated their oaths this week. And while my purview is smaller and different, I think that is something that is a great shame and something that we should be ashamed of. And I also will say that from my own perspective, it reminds me again that the reason that we have public education in Massachusetts is because John Adams knew that we needed it in order to continue to have a democracy. And so in many ways, I feel even more convicted in terms of my own work in education, because clearly we have work to do if there are people who thought that was a solution this week. So thanks again to all of you who are doing so much. Those of you who are teachers, certainly those of you who are parents who now are having to do another round of juggling. I know it's a challenge. Let's try to think about this in terms of solutions coming and things getting better. And as you need things, as there are things that we should know, as always, please make sure that you let me know. Thanks very much.